One man built a global empire from the ashes of the Holocaust. His daughter ended up in a federal prison for the world's most depraved sex trafficking ring. This is not just a scandal. It's the 70-year disintegration of the House of Maxwell. The Maxwell Dynasty stands as a stark and unparalleled testament to both the dazzling heights of 20th-century media power and the abyssal depths of moral collapse within Britain. For a tumultuous, albeit brief period, their surname resonated globally, synonymous with a sprawling media empire built entirely on the chaotic, insatiable ambition of its founder, Robert Maxwell. This formidable dynasty was not born of inherited privilege, but painstakingly forged by a man who began life as Jan Ludwig Hoch, an impoverished Jewish refugee from Czechoslovakia. A survivor of the Holocaust's unimaginable horrors, Hoch, through sheer will and relentless reinvention, transformed himself into one of the world's wealthiest and most feared figures. For 2 generations, the Maxwell name wielded immense influence, profoundly shaping vast swaths of Britain's media landscape. Their most audacious move was the audacious takeover of Mirror Group newspapers, which saw the venerable Daily Mirror, a national institution, degraded into Maxwell's personal political weapon. Their reach extended far beyond domestic media, permeating the highest echelons of global politics. Maxwell was a man who effortlessly shook hands with world leaders, while simultaneously attracting persistent suspicions of deep, clandestine ties to intelligence agencies spanning from Israel's Mossad to the Soviet Union's KGB. His colossal fortune, estimated at nearly $2 billion in 1991, fueled an ostentatious 1980s lifestyle of unparalleled extravagance. Palatial mansions, a fleet of private jets, and the infamous super yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. But this glittering facade of success was a fragile mask, concealing a structural decay that would soon lead to a historic unraveling. Yet, unlike the enduring, albeit controversial Murdoch dynasty, the Maxwell's saga was tragically defined by not one, but 2 catastrophic, generation-spanning collapses. Their history is a grim chronicle of ruthless business tactics, elaborate financial deceit, and, most infamously, Robert Maxwell's mysterious death at sea. His demise peeled back the curtain on a staggering £460 million fraud, brazenly plundered from his own employees' pension funds. The final, if fatal blow to the family's already tarnished legacy came decades later, delivered by his once favored youngest daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted of child sex trafficking. This relentless cascade of scandals utterly decimated their fortune, permanently entwining their name with an indelible legacy of criminality. To understand how such a colossal structure could vanish so utterly, one must look beyond the balance sheets and into the psychological wreckage of its architect. The Maxwell dynasty offers a searing, costly lesson in the fragility of an empire constructed entirely on a foundation of lies. It is the epic journey from an anonymous refugee to a notorious robber baron, a narrative devoid of inherited privilege. Instead, it was brutally forged from primal survival instincts, a complete and often terrifying personal reinvention, and a desperate, all-consuming hunger born from unimaginable, genocidal loss. The entirety of this chaotic empire, its vast media conglomerates, its political influence, its inherent duplicity, and its ultimate descent into criminality, serves as a direct, chilling reflection of its founder, Robert Maxwell. He was a man who didn't merely accumulate wealth. He meticulously constructed his entire identity from the desolate ashes of his annihilated past. To comprehend the immense scale of this moral and financial collapse, one must first return to the desolate landscape where the Maxwell myth began. Chapter 1. The Survivor's Reinvention. Born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch in 1923, he entered a world defined by crushing poverty. His birthplace was the tiny, remote rural village of Slatinske Doli, nestled deep within the rugged Carpathian mountains of what was then Czechoslovakia. He was one of 9 children in a devout Orthodox Jewish family, so destitute that the children often shared a single straw mattress, owned no shoes, and lived in a cramped 2-room shack with a bare dirt floor. His father scraped by as a farm laborer and a small-time cattle dealer. This was a world of medieval poverty, a brutal, hand-to-mouth existence on the forgotten, unforgiving fringes of Europe. This profound, early deprivation seared into the young Hoch an almost animalistic instinct for survival and a burning, desperate need to escape his predetermined fate. By all accounts, he was intensely intelligent, restlessly ambitious, and possessed a natural charisma that belied his circumstances. As a teenager, he severed ties with his home, embarking on a perilous journey across Europe, voraciously learning languages as he went. He would eventually master at least 9 fluently, becoming a linguistic chameleon. He was a natural actor, driven by a raw, primal ambition, never again to be poor, powerless, or a victim. His escape from his homeland came just in time. In 1939, Nazi Germany brutally invaded Czechoslovakia, unleashing the Holocaust upon the Jewish communities of Central Europe. The vibrant world that had defined his childhood was about to be systematically erased. Hoch, a Jewish teenager, fled with his life, while undertaking a perilous journey across Hungary and the Balkans. He eventually reached France, where, in a desperate bid for survival, he joined the French Foreign Legion, only to desert and make his way to Britain in 1940 as a penniless refugee. While he was actively reinventing himself in England, the life he had so desperately fled was being extinguished. The Nazi occupation of his homeland was total and merciless. His parents, his grandfather, and 4 of his siblings were rounded up, transported to the Auschwitz extermination camp, and brutally murdered. Of his immediate 9-person family, only he and 2 of his sisters would survive the war. This unimaginable loss, this genocide that personally wiped out almost everyone he loved, became the central defining trauma of the Maxwell story. Robert Maxwell was not merely a poor boy who made good. He was a survivor of an atrocity that fundamentally shattered his world. This profound void, according to many biographers and psychologists, created a moral black hole within his character. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of powerlessness, and he would spend the rest of his life accumulating power and money with a desperation that bordered on madness. He trusted no one, believed in no system, and profoundly felt that the normal rules of society, the very rules of a world that had stood by and watched his family be murdered, simply did not apply to him. In Britain, Jan Hoch continued his remarkable transformation. He enlisted in the British Army, initially serving in the Pioneer Corps. Later, through sheer force of personality and his exceptional linguistic skills, he secured a commission as an officer in the esteemed North Staffordshire Regiment. It was during this period that he adopted a new, thoroughly British name, Robert Maxwell. He fought with conspicuous, almost reckless bravery, seeing action in the pivotal Normandy landings and the subsequent arduous fight across France and Germany. He emerged as a natural leader, aggressive, decisive, and seemingly fearless in the face of death. In January 1945, amidst the brutal fighting in Germany, he led his platoon in a daring assault on a heavily fortified German machine gun nest, an action for which he was awarded the prestigious Military Cross for gallantry. By the end of the war, he was Captain Robert Maxwell, a decorated British war hero, and a man who had completely and successfully fabricated a new identity, burying his past as Jan Hoch, the poor Jewish boy from Slatinske Doli. Yet, this new identity was more than just a convenient alias. It was a calculated act of cultural theft. Indeed, the profound historical irony behind the name Maxwell itself reveals the sheer scale of this radical reinvention. For centuries, this surname belonged to the Maxwells of Finnebrogue, a distinguished Anglo-Irish gentry line descending from the 17th century Reverend Robert Maxwell, Dean of Armagh. Their traditional power and influence were deeply rooted in vast land ownership in County Down. The 20th century media baron was not joining this existing ancient dynasty. Born Jan Ludwig Hoch, he had experimented with several aliases, including Yvon du Maurier and Leslie Smith, before legally naturalizing and changing his name to Ian Robert Maxwell in 1948. He deliberately appropriated this noble-sounding British surname as a prestigious cloak to conceal his traumatic refugee origins, forging a completely new empire from nothing. This profound reinvention was not solely personal, it extended to his romantic life as well. In 1945, while still a young officer, he met Elizabeth Betty Maynard, a French Protestant intellectual and scholar from a respected established family. Their connection was immediate and intensely profound, leading to their marriage in March 1945. Betty would become the stoic matriarch of the Maxwell Dynasty, a woman of profound intelligence and immense fortitude who would bear him 9 children and endure his chaotic, tyrannical, and notoriously unfaithful behavior for over 4 decades. She provided the aristocratic stability and intellectual legitimacy that he, the rough-hewn survivor, so desperately craved. She was the anchor to the respectable world he was so determined to conquer. After the war, Maxwell found himself stationed in Berlin, working in the press and propaganda section of the British Control Commission. This posting offered him his very first taste of the 2 industries that would ultimately define his entire life: media and intelligence. His job was to control the flow of information in the shattered German capital, a city brutally carved up by the 4 Allied powers, a true hotbed of espionage where information was currency and alliances were notoriously fluid. It was here, amidst the post-war chaos, that Maxwell's darker, more clandestine connections are alleged to have begun. Biographers and intelligence historians have long posited that Maxwell's unique position, coupled with his extraordinary linguistic skills, made him a prime recruitment target for multiple intelligence agencies. Gordon Thomas, in his provocative 2002 book Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, alleged that Maxwell was recruited by Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, as early as the late 1940s or 1950s. This theory posits that Maxwell, as a passionate, if secular, Jew deeply affected by the Holocaust, felt a profound loyalty to the nascent Jewish state and used his growing European connections to provide them with invaluable information and access. Other reports, including declassified MI6 documents and Soviet-era defector testimonies, suggested he also served, at various times, as an asset for Britain's MI6 and even the KGB. This complex narrative paints Maxwell not as a loyal agent beholden to any single country, but rather as the ultimate double agent, or more accurately, an agent of influence. A man who masterfully played all sides, trading secrets and access for political favor and immense financial gain. In this view, he was the consummate opportunist, loyal only to himself, leveraging the pervasive paranoia of the Cold War for his own Machiavellian benefit. While the full extent of his intelligence work remains murky, Maxwell recognized that shadows alone could not sustain an empire. He understood that true, untouchable power required a legitimate commercial engine, one that would provide him with a respectable front for his more clandestine ambitions. However, Maxwell's primary, overriding focus was not espionage. It was business. And he saw a colossal commercial opportunity in post-war Berlin. German academic and scientific research, once the undisputed best in the world, lay in ruins, its venerable publishing houses shattered. Maxwell, alongside a partner, Ferdinand Springer, struck a shrewd deal. They would become the exclusive global distributors for the extensive back catalog of German scientific journals. In 1949, Maxwell ruthlessly bought out his partner, a maneuver that would become his signature style: swift, decisive, and often brutal. He promptly renamed the fledgling company Pergamon Press. This was the nascent foundation of his empire. His business model was deceptively simple, yet brilliantly effective. He would acquire the rights to scientific and technical journals, translate them into English, and then sell high-priced subscriptions to university libraries, research institutions, and corporations in Britain and the United States. It was a low-risk, high-margin gold mine. The content was created for free by academics seeking prestige. The demand from institutional libraries was incredibly inelastic. While not an absolute monopoly, as he still faced competition from learned societies and rising commercial rivals like Elsevier, Pergamon achieved massive market dominance. Crucially, subscription prices could be raised exponentially with little pushback, allowing Maxwell to position himself as a highly lucrative toll booth on the superhighway of scientific progress. However, for a man driven by the insatiable ghosts of his past, steady profit was never enough. Maxwell's ambition quickly outstripped his legitimate successes as he sought the illusion of exponential growth, a desperate need to be seen as a global titan, even if it meant distorting reality itself. This relentless drive led to the first major scandal of his career, an incident that indelibly established the pattern of financial deception that would ultimately destroy his family. In 1969, Maxwell attempted to sell Pergamon Press to an American company, Liasco Data Processing. During the due diligence process, Liasco's auditors uncovered massive systemic irregularities. They discovered that Maxwell had been systematically and fraudulently inflating Pergamon's profits through a series of elaborate shell games. These included illicitly shifting profits between his private family companies and the publicly traded Pergamon, booking sales that had not yet occurred, and brazenly manipulating inventory values. The deal collapsed in ignominy. The British government's Department of Trade and Industry, DTI, swiftly launched a formal investigation. The resulting 1971 DTI report was one of the most damning indictments ever leveled at a major British public figure. Its inspectors famously concluded, in scathing and unforgettable language, that Robert Maxwell is not a person who can be relied on to exercise proper stewardship of a publicly quoted company. It was a public execution of his professional reputation. Maxwell was disgraced, humiliated, and summarily forced out of the leadership of Pergamon. He became a pariah in the city of London, the very financial establishment he so desperately craved to join. Any other man would have been utterly ruined. But Maxwell, the ultimate survivor, treated this profound humiliation not as an end, but as a temporary, irritating setback. It merely reinforced his deeply cynical worldview. The establishment was nothing more than a cartel, designed to keep men like him out. If they would not allow him to join their game, he would simply create his own, operating by his own ruthless rules. This nascent robber baron reputation was further cemented by his often turbulent political dealings. While building Pergamon, Maxwell had also ventured into politics, serving as a Labour Party Member of Parliament from 1964 to 1970. His political career was predictably loud, self-aggrandizing, and ultimately unsuccessful. He was widely perceived, even by members of his own party, as a loose cannon, adding a man whose colossal ego and notoriously questionable business ethics made him a considerable liability. Nonetheless, he relentlessly leveraged his political connections. As Maxwell struggled to salvage his professional standing, the same corrosive patterns of manipulation that defined his business dealings began to take a devastating toll on his private sanctuary. Chapter 2. Building the Maxwell Empire. The 1971 Department of Trade and Industry, DTI report was more than a professional setback. It was a public execution of Robert Maxwell's soul. To the starched shirt establishment of the City of London, the inspector's verdict, that Maxwell was not a person who can be relied on to exercise proper stewardship of a publicly quoted company, was a permanent decree of exile. In the insular, reputation-driven world of British high finance, Maxwell had become a ghost, a bouncing check, whose name was now shorthand for deception. Any other man would have retreated to a quiet life of luxury with his remaining private wealth. But Robert Maxwell was not any other man. He was a survivor of the Holocaust, a man who had seen his entire world turn to ash. To him, the DTI report was not a moral judgment. It was a declaration of war by an elite class that he believed had always conspired to destroy him. The years between 1971 and 1974 are often referred to as Maxwell's wilderness years. But this term is a misnomer. Far from wandering aimlessly, Maxwell was a general in exile, meticulously plotting a scorched earth campaign to reclaim his throne. He retreated to Headington Hill Hall, his palatial residence in Oxford, which he rented from the city council. From this command center, he orchestrated a complex, shadowy counteroffensive. He understood better than anyone that in the world of capitalism, reputation is a currency, but cash and control are the gold standard. While the press mocked him as a disgraced pariah, Maxwell was quietly leveraging his private offshore trusts, a structure so opaque that even the most seasoned investigators struggled to map them, to begin a stealthy reacquisition of Pergamon Press shares. His strategy was one of psychological and financial attrition. He knew that the American company, Liasco, which had attempted to take over Pergamon, was struggling to manage the specialized scientific publishing house. Maxwell, the ultimate linguistic and social chameleon, used his deep knowledge of Pergamon's internal culture to sow dissent. He remained a persistent, irritating thorn in the side of the new management, using his remaining board influence and legal maneuvers to paralyze decision-making. He was playing a long game, waiting for the moment when the gentlemen of the city would grow tired of the chaos he was expertly creating. During this period, the atmosphere at Headington Hill Hall became increasingly claustrophobic and intense. Maxwell's domestic life was never a sanctuary. It was a laboratory for his domineering will. As he fought to reclaim his public empire, he tightened his grip on his private one, his family. He demanded absolute, unwavering loyalty from his children. They were not merely his offspring. They were his soldiers, his witnesses, and sometimes his victims. He would oscillate between grandiose displays of affection and terrifying outbursts of rage. To his children, the 1971 DTI report was a shadow that loomed over every meal. They were taught that the world was hostile, that they, the establishment, were out to get the Maxwells, and that only through total submission to the patriarch could the family survive and prevail. By 1973, the tide began to turn. Liasco, frustrated by the lack of profits and Maxwell's relentless interference, was looking for an exit. The very man they had tried to depose was now the only one with the audacity and the hidden funds to take the company back. This was the ultimate irony. The establishment had declared him unfit to run a company, yet the market had created a situation where only he could save it. Maxwell sensed the weakness. In a series of bare-knuckle boardroom negotiations that have since become legendary in the annals of hostile takeovers, he outmaneuvered his rivals. He used a combination of intimidation, charm, and the sheer force of his personality to convince creditors that he was the only captain who could navigate the Pergamon ship. The climax came in 1974. Through a brutal proxy war, Maxwell regained absolute control of Pergamon Press. It was a victory of staggering proportions. He had stared into the abyss of total professional ruin and forced the abyss to blink. When he walked back into the Pergamon offices, it was not as a humbled man, but as a conquering hero returning from a crusade. This moment defined the Maxwell template, a cycle of scandal followed by a miraculous, vengeful comeback. He had proven to himself and to the world that the rules did not apply to him. If the City of London would not give him a seat at the table, he would simply buy the table and everyone sitting at it. This reclaimed Pergamon became the foundational engine for the Maxwell Dynasty's future. It was no longer just a publishing house, it was a personal piggy bank and a vehicle for his megalomania. And the victory of 1974 infused Maxwell with a sense of invincibility that would eventually lead to his ultimate downfall. He learned that he could cheat death, metaphorically and professionally, and this fueled a reckless expansionism. He began to see his life as a grand epic where he was the only protagonist, and everyone else, employees, bankers, and family, were merely extras in his drama. The wilderness years ended not in a quiet return to respectability, but in the birth of a media titan who would soon set his sights on the very heart of the British press, fueled by a primal need to avenge the humiliations of 1971. By the mid-1980s, Robert Maxwell had transitioned from a mere businessman into a self-styled global statesman. However, the victory at Fleet Street had not satiated his hunger, and it had only inflated his ego to a pathological degree. This third and final phase of the empire building was defined by a desperate, debt-fueled sprint toward global dominance, a period where the line between visionary expansion and criminal desperation finally dissolved. The turning point came in 1988 with Maxwell's obsession with the American market. He viewed the United States not just as a business opportunity, but as the final stage for his personal myth-making. To rival the likes of Murdoch, He launched a high-stakes, hostile takeover bid for the prestigious American publishing giant, Macmillan Incorporated. In a bidding war driven more by ego than economic logic, Maxwell paid a staggering $2.6 billion, a price that analysts at the time warned was wildly inflated. To fund this, he bypassed traditional prudence, and securing massive loans backed by the fluctuating value of his own company's shares. From this moment on, the Maxwell Communications Corporation, MCC, was no longer a business. It was a high-stakes Ponzi scheme dressed in a corporate suit. The financial pressure was immense. The interest payments on his multi-billion-dollar debt mountain were gargantuan, far outstripping the actual profits generated by Macmillan or the Mirror Group. Maxwell's response was not to retrench, but to double down. In 1991, he purchased the ailing New York Daily News, a move that was purely theatrical. He wanted to be a kingmaker in Manhattan, just as he was in London. But the Daily News was a financial black hole. To the public, Maxwell was still the triumphant titan, but behind the closed doors of his Holborn penthouse, he was a man staring into a financial abyss. It was during this period of terminal overextension that Maxwell committed his most unforgivable sin, the systematic looting of the Mirror Group pension funds. What began as a temporary borrowing of assets to stabilize his share prices soon devolved into a full-scale, brazen theft of over £460 million. He was effectively gambling with the retirement security of 30,000 employees to keep his creditors at bay. He used a complex web of private companies and offshore accounts to shuffle the stolen money, creating a labyrinth that baffled even his closest financial advisors. The psychological toll on the dynasty during these final years was devastating. His sons, Ian and Kevin, were now deeply embedded in the empire's machinery. They were no longer just observers, and they were forced participants in their father's frantic juggling act. Maxwell's treatment of them became increasingly erratic and cruel. He would force them to sign documents they didn't fully understand, binding them to his legal and financial fate. Kevin, in particular, was groomed as the financial wizard, tasked with managing the increasingly incoherent web of debts. The domestic atmosphere was one of pervasive paranoia. The Sun King was becoming a Mad King, convinced that a global conspiracy of bankers and journalists was out to destroy him. Even as the foundations were rotting, Maxwell maintained his performative philanthropy. He donated millions to Holocaust memorials and educational funds, seeking to cement his legacy as a man of virtue. This was the ultimate cognitive dissonance. The man who was stealing the life savings of his workers was also posing as a champion of moral remembrance. His sale of Pergamon Press to Elsevier in early 1991 for £440 million was hailed as a masterstroke, a move that supposedly saved his empire. In reality, every penny was immediately swallowed by his creditors, leaving nothing to replace the plundered pension funds. By late 1991, the walls were closing in. The global recession had hit, share prices were tumbling, and investigative journalists were beginning to sniff around the irregularities in the Mirror Group's accounts. The House of Cards was not just wobbling, it was beginning to disintegrate. Robert Maxwell, the ultimate survivor who had outrun the Nazis and the City of London establishment, and finally found himself in a race he could not win. The stage was set for the final, mysterious act on the super yacht Lady Ghislaine, an end that would leave his empire in ruins and his children to face the legal and moral consequences of his insatiable ambition. As the 1990s dawned, the shimmering facade of the Maxwell empire began to crack under the weight of a global recession and a debt mountain that had reached nearly £3 billion. This final phase was no longer about building, it was about survival at any cost. For Robert Maxwell, the man who had outrun the Holocaust and the British establishment, the fear of returning to the poverty of Jan Hok became a driving madness. It was this primal terror that led him to cross the ultimate moral red line, the plunder of the Mirror Group pension funds. And the mechanism of the crime was as cold as it was systematic. To prop up the falling share prices of his public companies, which were the collateral for his massive bank loans, Maxwell began borrowing from the retirement savings of his 30,000 employees. He treated the pension fund not as a sacred trust, but as a personal slush fund. Through a dizzying series of internal transfers and offshore shell games, over £460 million vanished into the black hole of his debts. The friend of the working man, as he loved to be called in the Daily Mirror, was effectively stealing the future security of the very people who had built his empire. Inside the Holborn penthouse, the atmosphere turned toxic. Maxwell's behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He was a man besieged, convinced that a cabal of city short sellers and Zionist conspirators were plotting his ruin. He installed even more sophisticated bugging devices, listening to his own children and senior editors. Ian and Kevin were trapped in a nightmare of complicity. Their father forced them to sign blank transfer forms and misleading financial statements, effectively binding them to his criminal fate. The Sun King had become a shadow of his former self, obese, exhausted, and desperately trying to juggle a dozen financial fires at once. The final act began in early November 1991. The banks were finally losing patience, and investigative journalists from the BBC and The Guardian were closing in on the pension fund irregularities. On the evening of November 4th, Maxwell boarded his super yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, in the Canary Islands. He was a man who had run out of road, out of credit, and out of lies. On the morning of November 5th, 1991, his naked body was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean. His death triggered the fastest corporate collapse in British history. Within weeks, the staggering scale of the fraud was revealed. The decorated war hero and media titan was unmasked as a common thief on a gargantuan scale. The Maxwell Dynasty didn't just fall, it evaporated. His sons were left to face trial and public loathing. His wife Betty was left with nothing but debts and shame, and his favorite daughter, Ghislaine, began her own dark journey into the shadows of Jeffrey Epstein's world. The empire built on shifting sands and lies had finally been reclaimed by the sea, leaving behind a legacy of ruined lives and a chilling warning about the nature of unchecked corporate power. However, the financial fissures appearing by the late 1980s were not merely the result of poor business decisions. They were the tremors of a double life built on secrets far more dangerous than debt. Chapter 3. The Shadow Empire. Behind this grand public-facing media empire lay a chilling shadow empire, a labyrinthine web of connections to the murky world of intelligence and illicit finance, a journey that had begun for him decades earlier in Berlin. As a global publisher with unprecedented high-level access in both Western and Eastern Bloc countries, Maxwell was a uniquely valuable asset. Declassified MI6 reports from the 1980s later confirmed their deep and persistent suspicion of him. They meticulously tracked his frequent, often unexplained trips to Bulgaria, then a hardline Soviet satellite state. MI6 analysts strongly believed Maxwell was using his companies, including BPC, British Printing Corporation, as fronts for elaborate money laundering operations on behalf of the Bulgarian secret police, and, by extension, the KGB. He was allegedly helping the Eastern Bloc circumvent stringent Western trade sanctions, taking illicit payments in exchange for high-tech printing equipment and crucial access to Western markets. Yet, Maxwell's geopolitical dexterity was not limited to the East. His most profound and ideological allegiance lay with the State of Israel. His most explosive alleged connection, however, was to Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. Allegations put forth by authors like Gordon Thomas and others paint a detailed picture of a deep, decades-long relationship. Maxwell, a Holocaust survivor, allegedly saw himself as a fervent defender of Israel. He reportedly provided Mossad agents with plausible cover identities as Pergamon journalists, utilized his extensive global travel to discreetly pass messages, and offered his vast network of influence to the Israeli state. This clandestine relationship allegedly culminated in a breathtaking act of global information control, the infamous Promise software scandal. Promise was a powerful database program, but Maxwell's software companies allegedly distributed a compromised version containing a hidden backdoor. This allowed Israeli intelligence to secretly siphon highly classified information from the countries that purchased it. Most terrifyingly, Unsubstantiated claims suggest that Maxwell may have utilized his deep political connections to allegedly facilitate the distribution of this spyware to the United States' most critical nuclear research and national security facilities, including Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratories. By doing so, Maxwell wasn't just a publisher. He was effectively holding the keys to America's national security apparatus, placing himself at the epicenter of a massive global espionage operation. But while he was masterfully manipulating international secrets, the financial foundations of his visible empire were reaching a breaking point. This was the precarious state of the Maxwell empire in 1990. On the surface, it projected an image of a colossal global entity. Maxwell, with his booming voice, his private helicopters, his personal Boeing 727, and his opulent $15 million yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, was a global celebrity. A billionaire who hobnobbed with presidents, prime ministers, and potentates worldwide. But beneath this glittering veneer lay a catastrophic fraud. The entire structure was leveraged to the hilt, on drowning under the weight of over £4 billion in debt. The legitimate profits from Pergamon and the Mirror were nowhere near sufficient to service the staggering interest payments on the loans he had taken to acquire Macmillan and the Daily News. Maxwell, desperate for cash to keep the increasingly anxious bankers at bay, had allegedly turned to the one source of money he could directly control, the pension funds of his own companies. He began to secretly and illegally plunder the Mirror Group newspaper pension fund, systematically siphoning the retirement savings of his 30,000 employees as if it were his personal piggy bank. He was using their hard-earned money to cover his spiraling corporate losses and to secure new, increasingly fraudulent loans, all in a desperate attempt to stave off a bankruptcy that was by then mathematically inevitable. He was no longer operating as a businessman. He was a cornered animal, orchestrating what would become the largest Ponzi scheme in British history. The damning 1971 DTI report had been proven tragically right, but on a scale no one could have possibly imagined. Robert Maxwell, the Holocaust survivor and war hero, had, through his avarice, become the very thing he claimed to despise, a predator. The sheer scale of this fraud, however, was not achieved in isolation. It was heavily facilitated by the complicity of the British financial establishment and a phenomenon known as the expectations gap. This gap referred to the stark difference between the public's assumption that auditors would actively detect fraud and the auditor's own belief that this was not their legal responsibility. Operating under a traditional, gentlemanly culture of self-regulation that relied on assumed trustworthiness rather than strict legal sanctions, the City of London's institutions frequently turned a blind eye to Maxwell's glaring red flags. Drawn by the promise of exorbitant fees, prestigious firms lent their invaluable reputation to his crumbling empire. The merchant bank Samuel Montague, for instance, orchestrated the flotation of Mirror Group newspapers and publicly vouched for Maxwell, with senior bankers insisting they found him to be Straight, Coopers, and Lybrand, his auditors. Our noticed suspicious activities regarding the pension funds, but rationalized that their task was not to ask questions. Furthermore, Goldman Sachs executed stock sales directly from the pension funds upon Maxwell's instruction, an act for which the Department of Trade and Industry later stated the bank bore more substantial responsibility regarding market manipulation. Ultimately, this systemic willful ignorance allowed Maxwell to weaponize the reputation of elite institutions to sustain his massive Ponzi scheme, leaving the pensioners completely unprotected. As the shadows of his clandestine life and the reality of his financial ruin finally converged, the grand stage Robert Maxwell had built began to collapse into a singular, fatal point of no return. Chapter 4. A Mysterious Death at Sea and the £460 million Theft. By the autumn of 1991, the frantic juggling act that defined Robert Maxwell's empire was visibly failing, and the cornered animal was rapidly running out of time. The colossal, debt-fueled empire he had spent a lifetime constructing was disintegrating in real time. The $2.6 billion he had paid for Macmillan Publishing and the hundreds of millions he had sunk into the failing New York Daily News were now immense anchors, dragging his entire conglomerate, Maxwell Communications Corporation, MCC, into a black hole of debt. He owed an estimated £2 billion to £3 billion to a consortium of international banks, and the payments were coming due. The pressure was so crushing that in March 1991, in a desperate bid to survive, he was forced to sell his prized creation, Pergamon Press, to Elsevier for £440 million. Yet even this massive infusion of cash was not enough. He was trapped in an inescapable financial death spiral. The share price of MCC was collapsing as rumors of his insolvency, once whispered, now circulated openly in the City of London and on Wall Street. To prop up the illusion of solvency and artificially inflate the share price, Maxwell was secretly and illegally using his own private companies to buy public MCC stock. To fund these clandestine purchases, he was draining cash from every profitable corner of his crumbling empire. But it wasn't enough. The hole was too deep, the financial abyss too vast. Desperate, and with the banks closing in like sharks, Maxwell turned to his final, a most sacrosanct source of cash, the pension funds of his own employees. However, this colossal theft was not executed in a vacuum. It was heavily enabled by the complicity of the British financial establishment and a phenomenon known as the expectations gap. Drawn by the promise of exorbitant fees, elite City of London institutions frequently turned a blind eye to Maxwell's glaring red flags. Merchant banks like Samuel Montague publicly vouched for his legitimacy to secure millions in fees, while investment giants like Goldman Sachs executed stock sales directly from the pension funds upon his instruction. Operating under a deeply flawed system of self-regulation, the financial markets relied naively on assumed trustworthiness, allowing Maxwell to ruthlessly exploit the gap between what the public expected regulators and auditors to catch and what they actually did. He began a systematic criminal raid on the Mirror Group newspaper's pension fund. This was the collective retirement savings of 30,000 journalists, printers, and office workers, a fund that was legally ring-fenced and, by law, untouchable. Maxwell, leveraging his absolute authority as chairman, secretly borrowed hundreds of millions of pounds from the pension fund. He used this stolen money to pay the interest on his corporate loans, to artificially prop up his company's share price, and to falsely convince the banks that his companies were still solvent. It was a massive, desperate, and illegal Ponzi scheme. He was literally robbing his own workers to delay a bankruptcy that, by October 1991, was mathematically inevitable. He was a man under unbearable pressure, facing imminent public and total ruin. The boy from Slatina, who had survived the Holocaust and conquered the world, was about to lose everything. On October 31st, 1991, Maxwell was in London for a frantic series of last-ditch meetings. He was desperately trying to negotiate the sale of his stake in an Israeli company, but the deal was faltering, slipping through his fingers. He was also scheduled to meet with the governor of the Bank of England to discuss his dire financial situation, a meeting that loomed like an execution. He was, by all accounts, erratic, explosive, and consumed by terror. On that fateful day, he had a furious, shouting argument with his son, Kevin Maxwell, who, as the financial architect of his father's increasingly desperate schemes, bore much of the burden. That night, needing to escape the suffocating pressure, Robert Maxwell boarded his private jet and flew to Gibraltar. There he boarded his magnificent 180-foot, $15 million superyacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named for his favorite daughter, his ultimate symbol of power, his opulent floating palace. He instructed his crew to set sail for the Canary Islands. For the next few days, Maxwell remained in constant, frantic communication with his sons, Kevin and Ian Maxwell, who were back in London, desperately trying to hold the crumbling empire together. He was also in contact with his bankers, who had now delivered an ultimatum, a meeting on November 5th to address the glaringly missing funds. The noose was tightening. The night of November 4th, 1991, was calm, eerily so. The Lady Ghislaine was cruising through the tranquil Atlantic waters off the coast of Tenerife. Maxwell had dinner alone in his opulent stateroom. He then made a series of agitated phone calls to his sons, to his executives in New York, and to his bankers. The crew noted his stressful, demanding behavior. He was reportedly suffering from a heavy cold and was in a foul, irritable mood. At approximately 4:25 a.m. on November 5th, Maxwell made one final, inconclusive phone call to his son Kevin. Sometime between that call and the breaking dawn, Robert Maxwell went to the stern of his yacht, a private deck area just outside his stateroom, and then he was gone. At 6 a.m., the Lady Ghislaine's crew began their morning duties. They quickly realized the patriarch was not in his suite. A hurried search of the ship yielded nothing. The bed was empty. The captain, as Maxwell had always insisted his crew address him, had vanished. The crew, now in a state of growing panic, sent out a mayday call. The Spanish Coast Guard was immediately alerted, and a massive air and sea search operation began. For the next 12 agonizing hours, the world's media held its breath. The disappearance of Robert Maxwell, one of the most famous and controversial men on Earth, from his own private yacht, was a story of almost unbelievable drama. At approximately 6 p.m. local time, a Spanish search helicopter spotted a body. It was a large, naked man floating face up in the calm, warm water, roughly 20 meters from where the Lady Ghislaine had first raised the alarm. A rescue crew winched the body from the sea. It was unmistakably Robert Maxwell. He was 68 years old. The questions began immediately, swirling like the sea currents around him. Was it an accident? Was it suicide? Or was it, as many began to whisper almost immediately, murder? The initial Spanish autopsy, conducted in Las Palmas, was swift and, many would later argue, suspiciously inconclusive. The preliminary findings suggested that Maxwell had suffered a heart attack or a stroke, had subsequently fallen from his yacht, and had drowned. This seemed plausible enough. He was an overweight, highly stressed 68-year-old man with known health issues. The Spanish authorities, perhaps eager to swiftly close such a high-profile and politically sensitive case, officially ruled the death an accident. The Maxwell family, led by his sons Kevin and Ian and his daughter Ghislaine, publicly and vehemently rejected this finding. They adamantly insisted that Robert Maxwell, despite his recent stress, was a strong swimmer and in good health. They refused to accept the verdict of a simple, clumsy accident. The family's reaction was swift and, to many observers, deeply strange. They immediately flew Maxwell's body not to England, his adopted home for 50 years, nor to France, his wife's home. Instead, they transported his 300-pound body, packed in ice, directly to Israel. On November 10, 1991, Robert Maxwell was accorded a state-like funeral, an honor almost unheard of for a foreign citizen. He was buried on the sacred Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, a deeply revered Jewish burial ground. The funeral itself was a stunning public display of his previously hidden high-level connections. It was attended by the highest echelon of the Israeli government, including then Prime Ministers Yitzhak Shamir and President Chaim Herzog. Multiple government ministers, generals, and reportedly the current and former heads of Mossad were all in attendance. Prime Minister Shamir himself delivered a eulogy, declaring unequivocally that Maxwell had done more for Israel than can be told today. This extraordinary event, the burial of a British media mogul in Israel, praised by its prime minister as a national hero, was like pouring gasoline on the burgeoning fire of conspiracy theories. The rumors that Maxwell had been a Mossad super spy, as alleged by authors like Gordon Thomas, exploded into the mainstream. The theories surrounding his death were complex and compelling. One prominent conspiracy narrative, put forward by some journalists and theorists, speculates that Mossad might have orchestrated his death as a cleanup operation. The motive? Maxwell, facing imminent financial ruin, had allegedly become a dangerous liability. He was, the theory goes, threatening to blackmail the Israeli government, threatening to reveal state secrets, perhaps about the compromised Promise software, or even Israel's clandestine nuclear program, unless they bailed out his failing empire. Mossad, unwilling to be blackmailed and needing to silence a loose cannon, allegedly dispatched a team to the Lady Ghislaine and disposed of him, staging it to look like an accident or suicide. Yet, away from the shadows of espionage, a simpler and perhaps more tragic explanation lay in the fractured psyche of the man himself. A competing theory, favored by Palestinian groups and some Arab states, suggested that while Maxwell was indeed a Mossad agent, he had been assassinated by the KGB. This theory posited that Maxwell was about to expose sensitive Soviet secrets, or that his death was a reprisal for his alleged role in the 1986 Mordecai Vanunu affair. Vanunu, an Israeli nuclear technician, had leaked secrets of Israel's nuclear program to the British press. He was subsequently lured from London to Rome, where he was kidnapped by Mossad and forcibly returned to Israel. Rumors had long persisted that Maxwell, through his British newspapers, had played a pivotal role in identifying Vanunu's location to Mossad. A third theory, simpler but just as dark, was suicide. This was the theory favored by many of the bankers and journalists who possessed a deep understanding of his catastrophic financial predicament. They argued that on November 5th, the very day his empire was poised to be formally exposed, Robert Maxwell, the ultimate survivor, the celebrated war hero, the man who had defined himself entirely by his success, simply could not face the ultimate public humiliation of bankruptcy and imprisonment. He could not bear to be Jan Hul, the poor, powerless victim, ever again. And so he had simply stepped off the back of his yacht into the calm, dark water. The family, particularly his widow, Elizabeth, fiercely rejected the suicide theory. To them, it was an admission of guilt, an acceptance that he was a criminal. Instead, they commissioned their own second autopsy in Israel. This private, inconclusive examination, its full findings never officially released, only deepened the mystery. This mystery was further fueled by the family's decision to bypass British soil, choosing instead a final resting place that would expose the true extent of Maxwell's hidden allegiances. While the Israeli pathologist confirmed drowning, the evidence for a fatal heart attack remained inconclusive. Ultimately, the official British inquest returned an open verdict, legally stating that the cause of death was drowning, but the exact manner, whether accident, suicide, or homicide, remained unknown. Officially, the mystery of Robert Maxwell's end would never be solved. However, most financial investigators and biographers lean toward the theory of suicide driven by the crushing pressure of his imminent exposure, or a sudden health crisis that led to a fatal fall. While Robert Maxwell was being laid to rest with the honors of a hero in Jerusalem, back in London, the mask of the billionaire titan was being violently stripped away to reveal a predator who had betrayed thousands. Chapter 5. The Scam of the Century. But the mystery of why he might have died was only just beginning to unravel. In London, in the hours and days immediately following Maxwell's death, the sprawling empire he had built collapsed like a house of cards. His death, which invalidated the keyman guarantee on many of his colossal loans, triggered an immediate call on his debts from the panicked banks. His sons, Kevin and Ian Maxwell, were abruptly left holding the bag, thrust into an impossible spotlight. They desperately attempted to reassure the banks, the volatile markets, and their 30,000 terrified employees that the company was sound. But their efforts were futile. They were trying to plug a black hole with a thimble. The bankers, led by formidable firms like Lloyds Bank and Goldman Sachs, descended on the company's headquarters. They were no longer dealing with the intimidating, bullying Robert Maxwell. They were dealing with meticulous accountants, and they demanded to see the books. What they found was not just debt. It was a fraud of breathtaking, unprecedented scale. The investigators quickly zeroed in on the Mirror Group pension funds. They discovered that a staggering £460 million, the entire retirement savings of 30,000 people, worth nearly $1 billion at the time, was gone. Robert Maxwell had stolen it. In the final, desperate months of his life, he had systematically forged documents, created an elaborate web of fake companies, and illegally transferred the pension fund's assets, its cash, its stocks, its bonds, into his private family holding companies. He had then used this stolen money as collateral to secure the massive, fraudulent loans that were the only thing keeping his crumbling empire afloat. He had, in effect, gambled his workers' entire future on a desperate, last-ditch attempt to save himself, and he had lost everything. The public reaction was one of sheer, unadulterated fury. The Daily Mirror, his very own paper, turned on his memory with a vengeance, condemning the man who had once been its charismatic, if flawed, proprietor. The wider British press, led by the influential Guardian and the Times, dubbed it the scam of the century. Maxwell, who had died just weeks earlier, was transformed overnight from a controversial media mogul into one of the most reviled villains in modern British history. The real victims were the 30,000 employees of the Mirror Group. These were not high-flying executives. They were printers, secretaries, truck drivers, and journalists who had worked their entire lives, faithfully contributing to their pension funds. They awoke to discover their retirement savings had vanished, leaving them facing an old age of poverty and despair. The anger and overwhelming sense of betrayal were palpable. Pensioners who had already retired were cruelly informed their checks would stop. Workers nearing retirement were told their fund was empty. The human cost of Maxwell's hubris was nothing short of catastrophic. But while the state struggled to mend the financial ruin, it was equally determined to hold someone accountable for the deception that caused it. There is a devastating irony at the heart of this dynasty. The matriarch, Elizabeth Maxwell, she dedicated her life to studying the Holocaust and the tragic role of the bystander, those who remain silent in the face of evil. Yet, her own family's saga is entirely defined by bystanders. Elite banks, prestigious auditors, and high society all looked the other way as Robert plundered pensions, and later, as Ghislaine facilitated unthinkable abuse. Even the family themselves became paralyzed bystanders on the altar of Robert's dark genius. To mitigate this catastrophic human cost, a massive rescue operation had to be mounted. Under immense public pressure, the British government established the Maxwell Pensions Unit and the Maxwell Pensioners Trust in 1992, injecting £2.5 million in emergency funding just to keep immediate pensions in payment. However, the true salvation of the fund was orchestrated by Sir John Cuckney, the Trust's chairman. Acting as a relentless broker, Cuckney pressured city institutions, banks, and complicit financial firms into an unprecedented £276 million out-of-court settlement. While it could not recover every stolen penny, this monumental campaign safeguarded the retirement of thousands. The outrage over the scandal ultimately forced a complete overhaul of British financial law, leading directly to the Pensions Act of 1995 and the creation of the Pension Compensation Board. In a dark and tragic irony, the creation of a system designed to prevent a fraud of this colossal scale from ever happening again became Robert Maxwell's most lasting legacy. For the Maxwell family, the nightmare was only just beginning. The empire was liquidated in a fire sale. Its assets parceled off for pennies on the dollar. The Daily Mirror was seized by the banks. Pergamon was gone. The New York Daily News was sold off for a pittance. The family's once vast wealth evaporated almost overnight, and then came the criminal charges. In June 1992, after a lengthy and exhaustive investigation by the Serious Fraud Office, Robert Maxwell's two chief lieutenants, his sons, Ian and Kevin Maxwell, were arrested in a dramatic dawn raid at their homes. They were charged with conspiracy to defraud, specifically for their alleged role in helping their father use the pension fund assets to prop up the failing empire. The subsequent trial, which began in 1995, became a national spectacle. It earned the dubious distinction of becoming the longest and most expensive fraud trial in British legal history, and lasting over 8 grueling months and costing the state an estimated £25 million. The prosecution meticulously laid out the complex Byzantine financial web their father had created. They argued, with compelling evidence, that Kevin Maxwell, as the financial whiz kid and his father's trusted right-hand man, must have known that the assets he was pledging for loans were in fact stolen from the pension fund. The defense, led by the finest lawyers money could buy, argued the precise opposite. The defense successfully argued that Kevin and Ian should be viewed not as willing co-conspirators, but as individuals deeply affected by their father's manipulative genius, a strategy that ultimately led to their acquittal despite lingering public skepticism. The jury, after a grueling trial that captivated the nation, delivered its verdict in January 1996. Not guilty. Kevin and Ian Maxwell were acquitted of all charges, Their lawyers, the finest money could buy, having successfully painted them not as complicit co-conspirators, but as the final, most tragic victims of their father's monstrous manipulation and insatiable greed. The brothers walked free from the courthouse, but they were anything but free. They were financially and socially ruined, stripped of their standing, their fortunes, and their good names. Kevin Maxwell, once destined to inherit a billion-dollar media empire, bore the crushing weight of becoming the biggest bankrupt in UK history, his personal debts spiraling to over £400 million. In just 5 short years, the Maxwell Dynasty, once a titan of industry and influence, had been utterly destroyed. The fall was absolute, a catastrophic implosion that turned the family name into a byword for theft, deceit, and ruin. Robert Maxwell was dead, his reputation in tatters, posthumously revealed as a grand embezzler. His sons were bankrupted, disgraced, and forever tainted. And 30,000 employees were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their stolen futures and plundered pensions. As the Maxwell brothers faded into the ignominy of bankruptcy and legal exhaustion in London, the family's legacy of predation found a new and more sinister laboratory across the Atlantic. Chapter 6. Daddy's Princess and the Epstein Connection. Yet, amidst the wreckage, one member of the family emerged with her reputation and, crucially, her private funds, surprisingly intact. The patriarch's youngest and most favored daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. While her brothers faced public humiliation and criminal charges, Ghislaine had quietly worked for her father in a capacity far removed from the high-stakes, fraudulent finance that had annihilated their family's empire. After her father's hasty funeral in Israel, she swiftly relocated to New York, grieving the loss of the man who had been the gravitational center of her universe. In 1992, at a moment of profound personal vulnerability, she was introduced to a charismatic, independently wealthy, and intensely mysterious American financier named Jeffrey Epstein. It was a meeting that, 2 decades later, would tragically unleash the second, and arguably even darker, chapter of the Maxwell family's public disgrace, marking Ghislaine's chilling transformation from Daddy's Princess to Epstein's Madam. Indeed, while the cavernous vacuum created by Robert Maxwell's sudden 1991 death relentlessly sucked his sons into a vortex of financial ruin and criminal indictment, his favorite daughter Ghislaine was already charting a different, far more sinister course. Kevin and Ian were left to grapple with the brutal public humiliation, a multi-billion-pound bankruptcy, and the ignominious criminal charges for a vast pension fund fraud that they vehemently insisted their father had orchestrated in secret. The precipitous fall of the House of Maxwell was not merely a scandal, it was a global spectacle, a Greek tragedy of operatic hubris and cataclysmic financial devastation played out on the world stage. But one member of the family, the youngest and most conspicuously favored, was, for a time, mysteriously shielded from the blast. Ghislaine Noelle Marion Maxwell, born on Christmas Day in 1961, stood apart from her brother's fate. She was conspicuously not involved in the high-stakes, fraudulent financial machinations that had ultimately destroyed them. Her role within the sprawling Maxwell empire had been distinctly different, less corporate, more personal, and primarily social. She was, and seemingly had always been, her father's princess, his indispensable shadow, his confidant. This unique, intensely codependent, and as many psychologists and biographers would later argue, deeply toxic relationship, had been the singular defining force of her entire life. It was this profoundly ingrained dynamic that would directly set the stage for the second, and even more morally repugnant, act of the Maxwell family tragedy. Ghislaine's childhood was one of extraordinary, almost imperial, privilege. As the youngest of 9 children born to Robert and Elizabeth, Betty Maxwell, she did not merely grow up in a house. She resided in Headington Hill Hall, a magnificent 53-room mansion in Oxford that her father leased from the city. This grand estate was not just a home. It was the family's opulent court, with Robert Maxwell, the self-made colossus, reigning as an undisputed tyrannical king. He was a monster, as some close to the family would later attest, a force of nature who subjected his wife and children to explosive rages, on relentless demands for absolute perfection, and cruel psychological games that pitted them against each other. In her poignant 1994 memoir, Betty Maxwell recalled how Ghislaine, as a bewildered toddler, was often virtually ignored by her parents, particularly in the harrowing aftermath of the devastating injury of her older brother Michael, who fell into an irreversible coma after a horrific car accident. According to her mother's heartbreaking account, the young Ghislaine, desperate for recognition, once stood before her and declared with a child's simple plea, "Mommy, I exist." From that moment, Ghislaine seemingly willed herself into the very center of the family's turbulent orbit, transforming through a potent combination of innate charm, sharp wit, and sheer force of will, into her father's undeniable favorite. She learned, and with an almost primal instinct, that the only way to not just survive, but truly thrive, in the capricious court of King Robert was through absolute, unwavering, unquestioning loyalty. While her brothers were rigorously groomed for the brutal, unforgiving world of business, Ghislaine was meticulously groomed for companionship, for devotion. She became the one he trusted implicitly, the one he doted on above all others. Her education was top tier, a reflection of her father's expectations, if not always her direct path. She attended the prestigious Marlborough College, followed by Balliol College at the University of Oxford, where she earned a degree in modern history and languages. But her real, most profound education was at her father's side, shadowing him. She became a constant fixture in his glamorous, high-powered social life, and a polished extension of his will. She served as a director of the Oxford United Football Club, a cherished plaything her father had rescued from bankruptcy. She founded a women's social club, further cementing her social standing. She worked at the European, her father's ambitious fledgling international newspaper, learning the mechanics of his media machine. In 1986, in a testament to her elevated status, he christened his magnificent 187-foot superyacht the Lady Ghislaine, the ultimate symbol of her position and his affection. She spent vast amounts of time on board, hosting her father's high-powered guests, an eclectic mix of politicians, international celebrities, and even royalty, with a natural charm and social grace that he, the rough-hewn brawler, as he was often described, conspicuously lacked. In January 1991, as Robert Maxwell's sprawling empire began its agonizing, irreversible crumble, he dispatched Ghislaine to New York City. Her official role was to act as his emissary or representative at the newly acquired and deeply troubled New York Daily News. Her real job, however, was far more strategic and social: to be a socialite. He had, as one report vividly noted, tailor-made a New York company for her, a corporate gifts business that was largely unprofitable. Her true function was to leverage her innate charm, her distinctive Oxford accent, and the formidable power of the Maxwell name to open doors for him in the exclusive, elite social and financial circles of Manhattan. For 10 exhilarating months, she was truly the toast of New York, a radiant fixture on the high society party circuit. She was the billionaire's daughter, the charming, unwitty, and seemingly powerful representative of the vast Maxwell media empire, basking in the reflected glow of her father's formidable might. Then, on November 5, 1991, her world abruptly ended. Her father, the man who was the very source of her identity, her immense wealth, her unquestioned power, and indeed, her entire sense of self, disappeared from the Lady Ghislaine and was found dead. The psychological blow was total, cataclysmic. Ghislaine, demonstrating a startling composure, was the one chosen by the family to face the world's ravenous media in the Canary Islands, stoically reading a statement of grief in fluent Spanish. But the profound personal loss was immediately, savagely compounded by the catastrophic social and financial fallout. Within a mere few weeks, the scam of the century was chillingly uncovered. The staggering £460 million pension fund theft was revealed in all its sickening detail. The Maxwell name, once a symbol of unbridled power and influence, was now irrevocably synonymous with thief. Ghislaine, who just weeks before had been the sparkling toast of New York, was now a reviled social pariah, the daughter of the most hated man in Britain. In the wreckage of her first empire, Ghislaine did not seek redemption. She sought a replacement for the void left by her father's tyranny. Her financial situation, as The Guardian and other papers would soon report, was utterly dire. The family's vast assets were frozen, the crumbling empire seized by the banks, and her brothers, Ian and Kevin, faced imminent criminal charges. Ghislaine, accustomed to a life of unimaginable luxury in a lavish New York apartment, was forced to decamp to a modest studio. The power, the access, and the endless river of money that had defined her entire existence were gone, vanished in the wake of her father's death and disgrace. She was 30 years old, profoundly grieving, publicly humiliated, and financially ruined. It was in this moment of absolute, crushing vulnerability that she was unexpectedly thrown a lifeline. In 1991, at some point shortly before or immediately after her father's death, Ghislaine Maxwell was introduced to Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein at the time was a mysterious and intensely private financier, not yet the infamous monster of the 2000s. He was a math prodigy who had dropped out of college, briefly taught at a prestigious private school, and then made a meteoric, yet largely unexplained rise through the echelons of Wall Street. First at Bear Stearns and then, allegedly, managing the multi-billion-dollar fortune of his sole client, retail magnate Les Wexner. Epstein was, in essence, a disquieting new version of her father, a self-made, intensely secretive, and spectacularly wealthy man who operated with audacious impunity, seemingly outside the normal rules that governed society. He was, as The Guardian would later chillingly note, the one person in New York's elite circles who did not abandon Ghislaine after her father's spectacular fall. Instead, he stood by her. He provided her with money, a lavish home, and most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose. Their relationship was, for a time, romantic, but it quickly evolved into something far more complex, symbiotic, and deeply codependent. Epstein offered Ghislaine a new role, a new kingdom, and she had lost her coveted position as the princess in King Robert's court. Epstein made her the queen of his. By 1992, mere months after her father's death, Ghislaine was no longer a grieving outcast. She was assertively managing Jeffrey Epstein's sprawling estate in Palm Beach, Florida. David Rogers, Epstein's longtime pilot, would later testify that from the moment Ghislaine arrived, she right away took over, imperiously telling staff that she was the lady of the house and was now in charge of all of Epstein's properties. But this domestic control was merely the infrastructure for a more predatory architecture, where social grace became a weapon of entrapment. This was the genesis of the trauma bond that prosecutors and psychologists would later meticulously analyze during her criminal trial. Ghislaine, having lost her tyrannical, all-powerful father figure and the absolute control he exerted over her life, had found another. She seamlessly transferred the absolute, unquestioning loyalty she had once shown to Robert Maxwell directly onto Jeffrey Epstein. She would once again become the indispensable emissary, the formidable social gatekeeper, the trusted partner, and the ruthless enforcer within Epstein's burgeoning clandestine world. But the partnership she entered into with Epstein was not just about managing his luxurious homes and orchestrating his elaborate social calendar. It was, as federal prosecutors would later irrefutably prove in court, a sprawling criminal enterprise. According to the U.S. Department of Justice's devastating 2019 findings, Ghislaine Maxwell was accused of playing a central, instrumental role in assisting Jeffrey Epstein in his unlawful activities over a decade-long period. She was portrayed not merely as a companion, but as a meticulous organizer and facilitator who helped manage his complex social and logistical arrangements, essential to his predation. Court documents and chilling testimonies described her as a well-connected figure who leveraged her name and networks to help Epstein maintain access to exclusive social circles, effectively lowering the guard of his unsuspecting victims and associates. Maxwell's polished reputation and seemingly charming demeanor reportedly made it far easier for him to approach people and present himself as trustworthy, an insidious cloak for his true intentions. Her method of psychological control was chillingly calculated. Experts refer to Ghislaine's manipulation tactics as a seasoning process. She did not rely on immediate brute force. Instead, she leveraged the intoxicating allure of wealth and elite status to systematically erode the victim's boundaries over time. Targeting a young girl's vulnerabilities and ambitions, promising to fund their education or launch their careers, she would slowly normalize sexualization. The escalation was methodical, starting with requests for non-sexual massages, deliberately undressing in front of them to diss. Several witnesses vividly stated that she organized intricate schedules, managed numerous staff members across multiple continents, and meticulously coordinated travel arrangements among various Epstein properties, including sprawling residences in New York, the opulent estate in Florida, and the secluded, on a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Her pervasive influence and active participation gave structure, efficiency, and most critically, a convincing facade of legitimacy to Epstein's depraved operations. During her high-profile 2021 trial, prosecutors masterfully depicted a repeated, sickening pattern of manipulation and abuse of power, while the defense steadfastly maintained that she was being unfairly blamed for Epstein's crimes, a convenient scapegoat after his death. The jury's verdict ultimately found her guilty on multiple counts, and she received a significant, well-deserved prison sentence, marking the resounding end of one of the most publicized and horrifying criminal cases of the decade. The heinous act of moving a minor across state lines for a sexual purpose was the undeniable cornerstone of the federal charges of sex trafficking against her. Furthermore, prosecutors and victims tragically alleged that Maxwell and Epstein conspired to create a chilling pyramid scheme of abuse, where they would pay some victims to recruit their own underage friends and classmates, thereby creating an ever-expanding insidious network of underage victims for Epstein to sexually exploit. As the Department of Justice indictment grimly stated, this criminal enterprise continued for at least a decade, a period during which Ghislaine and Epstein operated with shocking impunity at the highest echelons of global society. They were widely perceived as a power couple, and frequently photographed at glittering parties with influential figures like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, and most fatefully, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. However, the high society immunity that had shielded the Maxwell name for decades finally dissolved as the voices of the victims grew louder than the silence of the powerful. The Prince Andrew connection would prove to be one of the most explosive and damaging aspects of the entire scandal. Virginia Giuffre alleged that she was trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell to the prince on 3 separate occasions, beginning when she was just 17 years old. The most notorious rendezvous, she claimed, took place at Ghislaine Maxwell's own luxurious townhouse in London. The royal family and Prince Andrew himself vehemently denied the allegations for years. But their denials were severely damaged by the chilling existence of a photograph showing a smiling Prince Andrew with his arm wrapped firmly around the waist of a 17-year-old Virginia Roberts, with Ghislaine Maxwell grinning unsettlingly in the background. For years, these grave allegations against Epstein and his associates remained just whispers, unconfirmed rumors relegated to the gossip columns and the fringes of society. Epstein was investigated in Florida in 2005, an inquiry that notoriously resulted in a lenient sweetheart deal in 2008, where he pleaded guilty to state charges, served a mere 13 months, and was controversially granted federal immunity for himself and any potential co-conspirators. That immunity deal, it was widely assumed, protected Ghislaine Maxwell from further prosecution. But in 2019, following incredible, tenacious investigative journalism by Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald, federal prosecutors in New York, emboldened by the surging Me Too movement and a renewed public appetite for justice, reopened the case. They arrested Jeffrey Epstein on new, far-reaching federal sex trafficking charges. This time, there would be no sweetheart deal, no easy escape. Epstein, facing a life sentence in prison, died by suicide in his Manhattan jail cell in August 2019, under circumstances that continue to fuel speculation and public distrust. His death left one person definitively holding the bag: his chief co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell. For nearly a year following Epstein's death, Ghislaine vanished, becoming arguably the most hunted woman in the world, the focus of an international manhunt. On July 2, 2020, the FBI finally located her. She was not living in an exotic, non-extradition country, as many had speculated. Instead, she was hiding in plain sight, ensconced in a secluded million-dollar tuck-away mansion in the small, idyllic town of Bradford, New Hampshire. She was arrested by federal agents and charged by the U.S. Department of Justice for the Southern District of New York. Her trial, which commenced in November 2021, became a global media event, drawing intense scrutiny from around the world. The prosecution's case rested powerfully on the emotional, deeply disturbing, and damning testimony of 4 courageous women, including Annie Farmer, who described in harrowing, graphic detail the systematic grooming and abuse they had endured as teenagers at the hands of both Epstein and Maxwell. Ghislaine's defense team, comprising a high-powered legal team, argued that she was merely the victim of a false memory campaign, asserting that the victims were motivated by financial gain and that the real predator, Epstein, was conveniently dead. Their most striking psychological argument, subtly hinted at in sentencing memos, was the one that tied back to her father, that Ghislaine herself was a profound victim, psychologically damaged by her trauma bond with her monstrous father, Robert Maxwell, and that this deep-seated damage had been expertly exploited and subsequently transferred onto another monster, Jeffrey Epstein. The jury, however, did not buy it. On December 29, 2021, after 40 arduous hours of deliberation, Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty on 5 of the 6 counts, including the most serious charge, sex trafficking of a minor. On June 28, 2022, Judge Allison Nathan, describing Maxwell's conduct as heinous and predatory, sentenced her to a devastating 20 years in federal prison. She was also fined $750,000. The fallout for the other figures in Epstein's orbit was swift and unequivocal. Prince Andrew, facing a crippling civil lawsuit in New York brought by Virginia Giuffre, was stripped of his royal titles and military affiliations by his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, a truly unprecedented act for a sitting royal. In February 2022, just before he was due to be deposed, he settled the lawsuit out of court for an undisclosed but reportedly massive sum. He made no admission of guilt, but the settlement was widely seen as a total, humiliating capitulation to avoid further public disgrace and potential legal peril. Ghislaine Maxwell's siblings, including Ian Maxwell, publicly defended her, vehemently calling the trial unfair and maintaining her innocence, a last act of family loyalty. But the verdict stood as a final, damning judgment from the legal system and the court of public opinion. The Maxwell name, already synonymous with the scam of the century, was now inextricably linked to one of the most depraved and high-profile sex trafficking rings in modern history. Ghislaine Maxwell, prisoner 02879-509, is currently incarcerated at the low-security Federal Correctional Institution Tallahassee in Florida. She is not eligible for release until 2037. The favorite daughter, who had been raised in a 53-room palace, her father's pampered princess, had tragically followed his path of corruption, his entrenched belief that the rules did not apply to them, the powerful elite. And just like him, her ambition, her unwavering loyalty to a monstrous figure, and her participation in his crimes had led to a total, humiliating, and irreversible fall from grace, culminating in a public reckoning that cemented the tomb of Maxwell as a dynasty defined not by its fleeting achievements, but by its enduring, horrifying crimes. Ultimately, the fall of Ghislaine Maxwell was not an anomaly, but the tragic culmination of a transgenerational cycle of abuse. Raised under the absolute control of a traumatized, tyrannical father, she learned early that love required total submission to power. When she met Jeffrey Epstein, she seamlessly transferred that trauma bond to a new monster, weaponizing the very manipulation tactics she had survived in order to groom a new generation of victims. The abused had become the apex predator. While Ghislaine's conviction marked the end of her personal freedom, It was merely the final exclamation point on a much broader, generational disintegration that began long before she met Jeffrey Epstein. Chapter 7. The Generational Tragedy. The final unraveling of a dynasty, far from being a singular event, was a generational tragedy. The crimes that ultimately came to define the Maxwell Dynasty, from Robert's audacious financial fraud to Ghislaine's appalling sex trafficking, were not isolated aberrations. They were the direct, horrifying inheritance of a profound generational trauma, a legacy of dysfunction and moral decay. But the fall of the House of Maxwell was distinct in its grimness. The inheritance left to the 9 children of Robert and Elizabeth Maxwell was not one of dwindling assets, cherished art collections, or fading real estate. Theirs was a devastating legacy of mass public humiliation, staggering, crushing debt, and a psychological trauma so profound that it would irrevocably define their lives and, in the case of their most infamous sibling, metastasize into a second, even darker, criminal enterprise. The true day of the Maxwells was not a single cataclysmic event in 1991. It was the insidious beginning of a generational unraveling, a slow, agonizing exposure of a family not just broken by scandal, but dysfunctional at its very core, ruled by a patriarch whose long, malevolent shadow would continue to dictate their fates long after he himself was dead. The Maxwell family, which lived in the 53-room splendor of Headington Hill Hall, was never a family in the traditional, loving sense of the word. It was a court, a kingdom unto itself, and Robert Maxwell was its omnipotent, capricious son-king. Elizabeth Betty Maxwell, the matriarch, was a woman of extraordinary intellect, quiet dignity, and immense fortitude. A French Protestant scholar and a dedicated pioneering Holocaust researcher, she provided the aristocratic gravitas and academic legitimacy that her husband, the rough-hewn refugee, Robert Maxwell, so desperately craved to polish his self-made image. But she and her 9 children were ultimately mere subjects, orbiting the volcanic, unpredictable, and tyrannical ego of the patriarch. Robert Maxwell was, by all accounts, an absolute monster in the home. He was a notorious philanderer, conducting his affairs openly and brazenly, humiliating Elizabeth repeatedly. He was a relentless bully, demanding absolute, impossible perfection from his children, only to meet their earnest achievements with cruel ridicule and dismissive scorn. He would pit them against each other in a relentless, cutthroat competition for mere scraps of his fleeting affection and elusive approval. He was building not a loving family, but a stable of potential successors, each one forged in the high-pressure crucible of his impossible, soul-crushing expectations. The family's first great tragedy indelibly set the stage for this pervasive dynamic. Their eldest son, Michael, born in 1946, was the original golden boy, the anointed heir apparent, destined for greatness. In 1961, at the tender age of 15, he was involved in a devastating car accident that left him in an irreversible coma. He never recovered. For 7 agonizing years, Michael lay in a persistent vegetative state, kept alive by the family's immense resources and Betty's unwavering devotion, before finally succumbing in 1967. This profound, inexplicable loss hollowed out the family's emotional core. Betty devoted herself completely to Michael's care, but Robert, according to biographers, was utterly incapable of processing the raw grief. He saw it not as a human tragedy, but as a weakness, an imperfection in his carefully constructed dynasty. The loss of his chosen heir created an immense, palpable void, a position that the other children were now implicitly, almost instinctively, forced to compete for, desperately striving to fill. 2 sons, Ian and Kevin, were subsequently groomed to fill this impossible role. They became the business sons, the ones explicitly anointed to inherit the vast, complex empire. They were sent to the best schools, given nominal positions within the company to learn the ropes, and eventually brought into the chaotic, high-stakes inner circle of Maxwell's perilous financial world. Kevin Maxwell, in particular, became the replacement golden boy. He was intelligent, diligent, and most importantly, completely, utterly loyal to his father's vision. He ascended to become his father's right-hand man, the financial architect tasked with managing the increasingly complex and desperate juggling act of the family's precarious finances. He was the one, in the final frantic days leading up to Robert's death, on the other end of the phone, frantically trying to hold back the tidal wave of debt that threatened to engulf everything. And then there was Ghislaine, the youngest, the one who had, as her mother so acutely wrote, willed herself into existence as her father's favorite. She was not groomed for the cutthroat world of business. She was groomed, instead, aimed for companionship, for unquestioning devotion. She understood, with an almost primal instinct, that the path to her father's demanding heart was not through direct competition. She could never realistically beat Kevin in the labyrinthine world of finance. Instead, it was through absolute, mirror-like devotion. She adopted his tastes, championed his causes with unwavering fervor, and basked luxuriantly in his immense power and reflected glory. He, in turn, doted on her, famously naming his magnificent yacht the Lady Ghislaine, and trusting her implicitly as his social emissary. His need for absolute dominance morphed into severe paranoia. Maxwell secretly bugged the offices of his senior executives and tapped their phones to root out any trace of disloyalty, treating his corporate empire like a surveillance state. This bizarre need for exclusive psychological control extended most intensely to his favorite daughter. In a surreal display of their insulated and unnerving dynamic, a former secretary recalled an incident where Maxwell put his office phone on loudspeaker only to say, "Meow," to which Ghislaine replied, "Meow." The two engaged in this bizarre feline exchange for several minutes in front of baffled staff, a chilling testament to a master-servant bond where Robert held ultimate psychological authority. She was, in many ways, the one child who seemed to have truly won the game, tragically unaware that the prize she had secured was a potent, insidious form of psychological bondage. This was the deeply dysfunctional court, bound by this intricate web of power, loyalty, and manipulation that was utterly shattered on November 5, 1991. Robert Maxwell's death by drowning was far more than just the death of a father. It was the abrupt, violent death of an entire system, the collapse of a universe. The gravitational center of their world had vanished, leaving the 9 siblings spinning wildly in a terrifying void, suddenly exposed to the cold, harsh, unforgiving light of public scrutiny and brutal financial reality. The first casualty of this new, terrifying reality was the family's long-suffering matriarch, Elizabeth Maxwell. For 46 years, she had meticulously maintained the public face of aristocratic dignity, the loyal, long-suffering wife who had stoically endured his constant infidelities and his relentless tyranny. But this, too, was a carefully managed image, a public performance that belied the profound personal cost. In the final months of Maxwell's life, as the empire began its final descent and the carefully constructed edifice crumbled around them, Elizabeth found herself on the precipice of a different kind of exposure. As his behavior grew increasingly erratic, spiraling out of control alongside his clearly collapsing financial empire, Elizabeth Maxwell had finally reached her breaking point. She had already moved out of their London apartment, living for all intents and purposes as a woman separated from him by the time of his death. In 1994, Betty Maxwell, as she was known, released her searing memoir, A Mind of My Own. This was no sanitized hagiography of a grieving widow. It was a quietly devastating indictment, a carefully composed portrait of a man she knew intimately. She revealed Robert Maxwell as a relentless bully and a monstrous figure, a man whose infidelities were not merely rampant, but brazen, and whose psychological abuse of his children had been a constant, insidious force throughout their lives. She depicted a man pathologically incapable of trust, a veritable titan of secrets who had lied to his wife and children with the same chilling ease and practiced skill he employed when deceiving his bankers. The book served as her ultimate declaration of independence, a final, public severance from the man whose colossal name had defined, and in many ways imprisoned, her for decades. Yet, while Betty could achieve a moral separation, The Maxwell children remained hopelessly entangled in the financial wreckage of their father's empire. The gaping £460 million hole in the pension fund was far from an abstract number. It was a devastating vortex that relentlessly consumed their entire family legacy. In June 1992, the public was stunned when Kevin and Ian Maxwell, two of the favored sons, were arrested. The charges, conspiracy to defraud, were aimed directly at the heart of the dynasty, alleging that the sons had actively helped their father steal from his own employees. The subsequent 1996 trial became a brutal, very public dissection of the deeply dysfunctional Maxwell family dynamic. The prosecution's case was stark and simple. Kevin, as the group's financial director, must have been fully aware that the assets he was using to secure loans were, in fact, stolen directly from the pension fund. The defense, however, pivoted to a psychological argument. They contended that Kevin and Ian were not co-conspirators in their father's schemes, but rather profound victims of his overwhelming, suffocating, and domineering personality. The defense painted Robert Maxwell as a corporate tyrant, who ruthlessly demanded his children sign documents without question, lied to them repeatedly about the true source of funds, and would have professionally and personally destroyed them utterly had they ever dared to defy him. This was, effectively, a modern application of the Nuremberg defense. They were simply following orders, unable to resist their father's absolute authority. The jury, after enduring the longest fraud trial in British history, ultimately agreed. In January 1996, Ian and Kevin Maxwell were acquitted of all charges. It was a legal victory, but for the brothers, it represented a total personal and financial annihilation. Kevin Maxwell, once the golden boy and heir apparent to a multi-billion-pound empire, had already been declared bankrupt in 1992, with personal debts totaling a staggering £46.5 million, earning him the dubious record for the largest personal bankruptcy in UK history. He was left with literally nothing, his name forever synonymous with the scam of the century. Yet, while the sons remained buried under the rubble of the print empire, the Maxwell daughters recognized early that the currency of power was shifting from ink to algorithms. The Maxwell family itself, as a cohesive financial entity, ceased to exist. Yet, the aftermath for the surviving family members was far more complex than mere obscurity. It was a saga of drastic reinventions, persistent controversies, and hidden struggles. The matriarch, Elizabeth, a respected Holocaust scholar who earned her PhD from Oxford at age 60, found herself financially wiped out, stripped of her pension and relying on her children for support until her death in 2013. Kevin Maxwell could not escape financial scandal. His subsequent attempt at a comeback as a property magnate ended in the collapse of a construction company, leading to an 8-year ban from serving as a company director in 2011, alongside the divorce from his wife of 23 years, Pandora. Together with his brother Ian, who became somewhat of a recluse before publicly stepping forward to defend Ghislaine, Kevin eventually founded an anti-extremism think tank called Cogit. The twin sisters, Christine and Isabel, managed to pivot successfully into the booming 1990s tech industry, co-founding the early search engine Magellan and selling it to Excite for $18 million in stock. Christine, a former teacher who authored a best-selling spelling dictionary, went on to co-found Chiliad, developing data mining software utilized by the FBI. Isabel became deeply embedded in the Israeli tech sector and venture networks, but her personal life was turbulent. After 3 marriages, she was declared bankrupt by a British court in 2015, following the death of her third partner. Despite their diverse paths, from multi-million-dollar tech buyouts to repeat bankruptcies, the siblings remained inextricably bound and overshadowed by the toxic legacy of their name. This resilience extended even deeper into the third generation, and where the Maxwell bloodline successfully bypassed the family's notoriety to embed itself within the inner sanctum of American political power. Observe the trajectory of the Maxwell heirs, and a chilling pattern emerges. The family never truly lost power. They simply upgraded their tools. Robert built an empire by monopolizing print media. The next generation transitioned seamlessly into the digital age. Christine and Isabel mastered search engines and data mining for the FBI, while Ian and Kevin navigated intelligence and counterterrorism policy. From ink on paper to global data algorithms, the dynasty's true currency has always been the control of information. But the real, devastating second act of the family's disintegration was just beginning. And it centered on the one child who had seemingly escaped the immediate financial collapse: Ghislaine. When Robert Maxwell died, Ghislaine, then 30 years old, lost everything that truly mattered to her. She lost her father, the powerful king, who had adored her above all others. She lost her elevated social standing as the billionaire's daughter. She lost her immense financial security, her defined job, her perceived purpose, and ultimately, her very identity. As The Guardian noted with stark simplicity, she went from residing in a lavish Manhattan apartment to a small, nondescript studio, from a nascent power player to an absolute social outcast. It was in this moment of profound personal and existential crisis, a void of grief and social isolation, that Jeffrey Epstein entered her life. He was, in effect, a meticulously crafted replacement. Like her father, Epstein was a self-made man, intensely secretive, immensely powerful, and utterly unafraid to operate outside the conventional rules of society. He also shared her father's trait of possessing a colossal, demanding ego that required absolute, unquestioning loyalty from those in his orbit. And, crucially, he was the one person in New York's unforgiving elite who did not abandon her when her family name became radioactive. He rescued her, providing her not only with renewed financial security, but, more importantly, the purpose and belonging she had so desperately lost. Ghislaine, in what psychologists would later describe as a textbook example of trauma bonding, transferred the absolute, all-consuming loyalty she had been rigorously trained from birth to give her father directly onto Epstein. She would become his princess, his shadow, his indispensable partner, his gatekeeper to a hidden world. For 2 decades, this dark arrangement functioned perfectly. Ghislaine meticulously rebuilt her life, re-entering the global elite not as a Maxwell, but as the mysterious, charming girlfriend and highly effective fixer for the enigmatic billionaire Jeffrey Epstein. She was once again at the very center of a world of private jets, lavish homes, and incredibly powerful people. Her shattered and scattered siblings largely left her to it, consumed by their own struggles to survive the pervasive stigma of their family name. While the second generation of Maxwells navigated the fallout of their father's crimes and forged their own controversial paths, the third generation, Robert Maxwell's grandchildren, quietly embedded themselves within the highest echelons of the United States government. Alex Geraci, the only son of Isabel Maxwell, worked on Hillary Clinton's 2007-2008 presidential campaign before being appointed as Chief of Staff at the Office of the Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs under Secretary Clinton, where he specialized in shaping U.S. policy towards the Middle East. Meanwhile, Xavier Molina, Christine Maxwell's eldest son, worked on the 2008 Obama-Biden presidential campaign and subsequently secured a position as a staff assistant in the Executive Office of the President at the White House. While the service of Maxwell's grandchildren, such as Alex Geraci and Xavier Molina, within the Obama and Clinton administrations is a matter of public record, it remains a subject of intense debate whether their roles reflect the enduring influence of the Maxwell name or simply their own independent professional achievements. Although some view this as an upgrade of the family's power tools, these individuals possess distinguished academic backgrounds and have carved out distinct career paths. To date, there is no evidence to suggest they utilized their positions to serve the interests of the Maxwell dynasty. Rather, they appear to be a new generation successfully navigating a path out from under their family's long shadow. Then, in 2019, Epstein was arrested, triggering a renewed wave of public scrutiny. In 2020, Ghislaine herself was arrested. The Maxwell name, which the family had spent 29 long years desperately trying to rehabilitate and distance themselves from, was suddenly and violently thrust back into the global spotlight. This time, however, it was linked to a crime even darker and more reprehensible than financial fraud: the industrial-scale sexual trafficking of children. The final, horrifying disintegration of the Maxwell family was now complete and irrevocably public. The surviving family members were forced to confront the agonizing reality that their father's profound psychological legacy had directly enabled this new horror. The family's reaction to Ghislaine's arrest and subsequent trial was telling in its fragmentation. There was no unified public defense. Most of the siblings maintained a horrified public silence, are overwhelmed by the renewed shame. The one who did speak out, Ian Maxwell, became Ghislaine's most vocal defender, particularly in a series of interviews following her conviction, including a prominent one with the BBC in 2022. Ian did not, and indeed could not, defend his sister's abhorrent actions. Instead, he vehemently attacked the legal process itself. He called the trial unfair, a travesty of justice, and insisted she was nothing more than a scapegoat, being unjustly punished for the sins of Jeffrey Epstein, who had infamously escaped justice by dying. He and the few other family members who quietly supported her were essentially recycling the very same defense that had saved him in 1996, that Ghislaine was just another victim of a powerful, manipulative man. This defense was widely seen by the public, and crucially, by the victims themselves, as a grotesque and cynical deflection. Yet, in its own tragic way, it represented the profound, distorted truth of the Maxwell dynasty. The children had been so thoroughly shaped and psychologically conditioned by their father's tyrannical, reality-bending personality that even as middle-aged adults, they seemed utterly incapable of seeing the world outside of that warped framework. In their eyes, Ghislaine was indeed a victim, first of their father's relentless psychological abuse, and then of Epstein's predatory influence. The devastating fact that she had also become a predator herself, that she had victimized dozens of other young girls, was a horrifying reality they seemed psychologically unable or unwilling to process. The dynasty was now utterly gone. Its once respected philanthropic arms, like Elizabeth Maxwell's acclaimed Holocaust Research Foundation, had dissolved, irrevocably tainted by the family's dual scandals. The children were scattered, their lives permanently defined by the crimes of their father and their sister. The Maxwell name, once a symbol of audacious, self-made power, had become a byword for theft, corruption, and unspeakable sexual depravity. The inheritance Robert Maxwell had ultimately left his children was not a multi-billion-dollar empire, but a toxic legacy of trauma and shame, a life sentence from which they could never truly escape. Was he a Mossad spy or just a common thief? Robert Maxwell's death was so sudden, so convenient for so many powerful interests, and so intrinsically cinematic that the official verdict of an accidental drowning, perhaps complicated by a heart event, was never going to be enough to satisfy public curiosity. The man was simply too big, his secrets too dark and numerous to be attributed to such a prosaic end. He hadn't just died. He had vanished from a £15 million superyacht in the middle of the night at the exact moment his £4 billion fraudulent empire was collapsing around him. The stage was perfectly set for a lifetime of elaborate conspiracy theories. The most enduring of these theories consistently centered on his shadowy connections to the world of intelligence. Maxwell, it was widely alleged, was not merely a media mogul. He was, as his harshest critics and even some of his biographers contended, a man who played the great game, a super spy who had assiduously cultivated ties with MI6, the KGB, and, most intimately, Israel's Mossad. The Mossad assassination theory remains a dominant yet unproven narrative. Proponents of this theory claim that Maxwell's death could have been a meticulous cleanup operation, though no forensic evidence has ever confirmed this. Maxwell, the story went, was far more than just a friend to Israel. He was a long-term, high-level agent. He had allegedly used his vast global publishing network and his unparalleled political access to act as a crucial courier, a clandestine back channel, and a powerful agent of influence for the Israeli state. He was infamously implicated in the 1986 Mordecai Vanunu affair, with persistent rumors suggesting that his own Daily Mirror newspaper had inadvertently or intentionally helped Mossad identify and lure the nuclear whistleblower from London to Rome, where he was subsequently kidnapped. Maxwell was also alleged to have sold bugged versions of the Promise software to U.S. national security laboratories to facilitate Israeli mass spying. While there have been numerous allegations, most notably from author Gordon Thomas, claiming that Maxwell assisted Mossad in installing a backdoor into the Promise software to sell it to U.S. nuclear facilities such as Sandia and Los Alamos, this has never been proven with physical evidence or official court records. Both the U.S. and Israeli governments have consistently denied these claims. However, it is crucial to note that these dramatic claims of espionage and assassination remain unproven allegations, fiercely disputed by British and Israeli sources. Yet, true or not, these gripping theories created a dark, enduring mythology that perfectly suited the shadowy nature of his empire and his mysterious death.